All right, welcome, welcome. It is Friday, and I hope everyone is having a good late afternoon or early evening, depending on where you are. As people filter in, we're organizing your comments, and we'll just maybe chat a little bit about what's been happening in the news. One thing that came across my DMs earlier today from a friend in DC is he noticed something very interesting. He noticed that Ibram X. Kendi, the kind of the guru of quote unquote anti-racism, has very conspicuously changed his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And this book, you might remember, was like the book of the year in 2020 following the death of George Floyd. It was on every reading list, every university syllabus. It was in every, affluent, liberal household's bookshelf. It was almost a status symbol for your own racial enlightenment. But it had a very interesting sentence in it, really, that sums up his entire philosophy. And the quote was this: "The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination." And so what he means by this is that because of structural racism in the past, there has been disparities between racial groups in the present, and the only way to narrow the gap or eliminate the gap and equalize people by identity group is to engage in anti-racist discrimination. This means affirmative action, racial quotas, DEI programs, and income redistribution schemes based on race. And this is, of course, in total opposition to the spirit of the 14th Amendment, the Declaration, the Civil Rights Act. I mean, really, treating people unequally on a group basis to equalize outcomes is his philosophy. But he was beaten up for this so much in the last 3 years. My friend noticed that in the latest addition to his book, he's actually deleted that sentence entirely. He's written this really convoluted sentence with tons of adjectives and qualifiers to try to save face. But then he actually wrote, I was like, is this real? This is amazing. He wrote in the notes, he said that he deleted these sentences because they've been, quote, have been heavily quoted by the conservators of racism to attack me in this book. They strip these sentences of the context and meaning I establish in the paragraphs before and after them. They reject my definition of discrimination and the delineation between racist and anti-racist discrimination, even as these sentences are predicated on that definition and that delineation, all to substantiate their propaganda that my work is racist and that anti-racism is racist towards white people. So in other words, he's saying, some people noticed that I wrote my philosophy in very plain language. They exposed the fact that, yes, indeed, it is racially discriminatory. That's the whole point. But he has been so harmed by this, by the, quote, conservators of racism, aka anyone who doesn't agree wholeheartedly with Ibram Kendi, that he's actually wiped his most famous sentence from his book. This is, I think, kind of a victory. It's at least an intellectual victory, maybe at best a moral victory, probably not necessarily a political or logistical victory quite yet, but it's really telling. I mean, that Ibram Kendi, the guru of 2020, has retracted his basic philosophy because it's been proven so unpopular in the United States that even someone as kind of obstinate as Ibram Kendi has been forced to walk away from it. So that's just a great thing to hear on a Friday. That Henry Rogers, that's his birth name. He went for the Ibram X. Kendi as an affectation. Has now really retreated from his whole philosophy, and then made a quote, note on discrimination. This is why I took out these words from my book. Just unbelievable. A great thing. And I think that what we've seen in 2020, looking back, is that the left was so desperate to find a new voice that they settled on Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, two of really the least plausible people for intellectual leadership imaginable. But they published these books at just the right time, How to Be an Anti-Racist and White Fragility. But as they were subjected to scrutiny, they were really humiliated and forced into retreat. Robin DiAngelo, it almost seems like she hasn't left her house in a couple years. She doesn't appear in public at all. She never submits herself to any kind of debate. She's really retreated from public life. And now Ibram Kendi is kind of self-imploding his whole philosophy, just admitting intellectual defeat. And, you know, it's interesting because I've been subjected to, in some ways, a similar criticism. I sent some tweets during the fight against critical race theory that explain the strategy. We're rebranding critical race theory. We're driving up its negatives. We're going to make it toxic in the public mindset. And they've been Joy Reid, everyone has been repeating this over and over. I still get it in my Twitter comments. And the idea is that it exposes that I'm playing politics with intellectual ideas, and the critical race theory attack is specifically designed to undermine the philosophy. And it's supposed to be a gotcha against me, but I haven't backed away from it one bit. It's just true. That's why I tweeted it. And so sometimes when you tweet something true, even if your enemies come after you, you just have to man up and defend it. But of course, Ibram Kendi hasn't done that with his own work. And you'll apologize, I'm recovering from a little bit of a cold, so having a little bit of cough. But now that people are streaming in, I think that we'll start with some of the questions. First, let's start with a couple of questions that came in earlier today on Substack. These are from longtime readers or maybe some new readers, I'm not really sure. But we'll start with the question from someone calling him or herself Pluto. And it says, do you view wokeism as we know it simply as Western liberalism gone off the rails in the mode of Jordan Peterson or James Lindsay? Or was it an inevitable end result of Western liberalism that was going to happen regardless due to the weaknesses built within Western liberalism? This is the view supported by people such as Orrin McIntyre, Curtis Yarvin, and many of the post-liberal Claremont Institute type thinkers. This is an important question, and I don't think that there's necessarily an easy or a clear-cut answer. I'm sympathetic to elements of both arguments, in fact. I'm sympathetic to the kind of Jordan Peterson, James Lindsay position, as the commenter is saying, that wokeism is liberalism that has been hijacked by other ideological traditions or entrants, including Marxism, postmodernism, radical gender theory. This is obviously true. If you look at the 1960s, you look at the left-wing Marxist-Leninist revolutionary movements, the Black Panther Party, the Weather Underground, they're explicitly anti-liberal. They hate liberal democracy. If you look at the New Left's kind of grandfather, Herbert Marcuse, is a critic of liberal capitalist democracy and would hope to transcend it with the more Marxist or even kind of communist style, Western communist style system. And so you can make, I think, a clear argument that these are not natural ideologies that emerged from within the liberal tradition. I think that to a large extent that's true. But I also think that thinkers like Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame, some of the Claremont Institute folks, and even some of the more dissident thinkers on the right do raise a salient point. They say that it's actually the vulnerabilities of the liberal system that have enabled these ideologies to take power over our institutions, that have really exposed some fatal flaws in the Western liberal tradition. And I wouldn't go so far personally to say that these are fatal flaws, but if you look back at it, even early commenters, really pre-Marxist commenters, if you look at Alexis de Tocqueville, he saw a lot of these problems, a lot of these vulnerabilities rather, very early on in America's history. He said, quite famously that there were dangers to the democratizing nature of democracy, that there was also danger associated with the risk of centralized administration or centralized governance. And he also saw that American democracy and American liberalism was only as robust as it was because we had a civic tradition, we had high levels of social participation, and very strong religious manners and mores. And so someone like Patrick Deneen has I think, a sophisticated criticism of this. And he says, well, the liberal governance assumptions, shorn of the religious elements, the communitarian elements, the social capital and social fabric that made it possible to work, once those are all stripped away, what you get is a kind of unrestrained managerial state that will impose a bureaucratic ideology on its citizens that are liberalism that is warped into an anti-culture, which is a nice phrase that he uses in his book. And to a certain extent, I mean, he's not wrong. However, where I would depart from Professor Deneen and some of the other critics is that, the answer then is not to throw out the system, to throw out the constitutional system, to usher in a kind of neo-reactionary, technocratic future. I think it's to try to salvage and restore and rebuild some of those old Republican structures and virtues that I don't think are lost. And I really believe, contrary to some of the more radical figures, that all of America's problems can still be resolved through normal democratic politics. This is going to require us to get more activated in civil society, more activated in the education system, and really more activated in the partisan political system. But all of our problems can still be resolved through our Republican form of governance, through a commitment to the Constitution. And so while I appreciate some of the post-liberal thinkers for their diagnoses of specific problems or vulnerabilities within liberalism, I disagree that we should strive for a post-liberal future or a post-constitutional future. I think that's just a disaster waiting to happen, and I think it exaggerates some of the problems that we have, which in my view are still soluble through regular politics. Okay, next question. This is from Derek Zitko, and I'll paraphrase it for a little bit. How do we rational types who ascribe to facts don't care about your feelings battle those who are indoctrinated with our feelings don't care about your facts mindset? Their narrative trumps reality. We can ban materials and programs, but at the end of the day, educators can apply Marxist tactics to any materials. Short of cameras, how do you weed out facilitators and encourage our classrooms are led by genuine educators? Well, there are a few threads there to think through. But first, let's start with the very beginning. The facts don't care about your feelings. Look, it's funny. It was very clever, and I think it defined maybe a certain tendency in our politics a number of years ago. But ultimately, the facts don't care about your feelings line is wrong. It's also unhelpful. I don't think it actually yields successful political results. And in fact, actually, many of the most important ways to drive politics are irrational. They're based in emotions, narrative, sentiment, the subconscious. And conservatives who think that, facts and mathematical equations are going to defeat a sophisticated and emotionally moving narrative are going to get are going to get their asses handed to them every time. Facts and logic will destroy X, Y, and Z. No, that's not how it works. I think there is a place for rational persuasion. I think there is tremendous value to mathematical or scientific analysis of events, but ultimately, people are not automatons. They're not computer programs. People have a complex way of interacting with the world, and everything that we do as human beings is mediated through our feelings and emotions. And so if your politics eschews dealing with people on an emotional basis and appeals only to their logical minds, you're going to be very limited to whom you reach. You're going to be reaching a very small group of very kind of mathematically minded, Reddit people, and you're not going to actually move people and communicate with people in a way that is persuasive. And I think that life and politics is not an Oxford-style debate. And I love Oxford-style debates. I take every chance I get to participate in them. I think they're important. I think that they're valuable. But ultimately, in a mass democratic society, you move people through mechanisms of persuasion that touch at an emotional core. And so conservatives need to learn that. Second, Derek's asking about, how can you ensure that the educators are not going to be brainwashing kids in the classroom? Well, first of all, as a parent, thinking about it very practically, you should figure out who your child's teachers are. You or your spouse should visit in the classroom, sit in on some lectures, show up at the parent-teacher night, ask them questions. And I would say 9 times out of 10, it's quite obvious. If your teacher is a left-wing lunatic, your child's teacher is not going to be able to hide that very well, and certainly not be able to hide that over a sustained period of time. And also ask for the curriculum. Say, hey, what are you teaching? What does the curriculum look like? What books are they reading? And so I think that it's actually a pretty simple thing to figure out on a one-to-one basis, on a human basis, on a personal basis. And then on a political basis, how do you make sure that, that the teaching core in public schools, for example, is not dominated by left-wing activists? I think you could do it in 2 ways. One is a very specific set of reforms. You could reform teacher training programs. You could reform teacher certification. You could encourage more kind of diversity of background or viewpoint within the teaching core. There's ways to do that. But I think an even more important way is to actually establish and support alternatives to the public school system in your local community, in your state. And so we've seen, I think, 6 or 7 states now adopt universal school choice vouchers, essentially, that take state dollars, give them directly to parents, and then those parents can use it as homeschool support or taking them to a private school or even a religious school. And you have more control over who the teachers are. And especially if you're in a, let's say, a classical private school, K through 12, you can ensure by having a good board, by having a good headmaster, by really participating in that school community, you can hire people who are of a similar philosophical mind. And so I know even with my own kids in a classical school, I know exactly what their teachers believe. I know exactly the kind of materials that they're promoting. And I get an email every week outlining exactly what they're teaching, what virtues they're cultivating, what textbooks they're using. And then through engaging with the school, with the teachers, with the headmaster, I know that we're all rowing in the same direction. And that's what you have to do as a parent. And sometimes it takes a financial investment or financial sacrifice to say, hey, look, I'm going to spend the money to put my child in a school that will reflect my values. And sometimes it also requires you to even move or commute that extra 20 minutes or make another kind of sacrifice, because what you teach your children, and especially what other people teach your children in a school environment, it really matters. It's like almost too it's almost too basic to say. It's almost too obvious to say, but it really bears repeating. You want to teach them good things, and you don't want to teach them bad things. But unfortunately, people have been kind of brainwashed into believing that the content doesn't matter, that you want to teach critical thinking, that's what matters. But in fact, that's not true at all. The content matters, the value formation matters, the philosophy matters, the quality of the books matter, and it's not just training people into methods of thinking. Methods of thinking devoid of content is almost nothing. I mean, you're teaching them really nothing. You're not giving them the factual basis. You're not giving them the material basis, rather, for them to form opinions about the world. You need to know history, literature, philosophy, science. You need to actually grapple with the specific content. That's how kids learn, and that's what you should be trying to provide. And look, on the question of cameras, I think even Vivek Ramaswamy, the presidential candidate, is now saying we need to have cameras in all the classrooms. I think that's frankly insane. If you are sending your kids to school and you have such distrust with the teachers and administrators at that school that you would want cameras in the classroom, like a prison, monitoring the situation 24 hours a day, there are much deeper problems, and you should not send your kid to that school. It requires, of course, verification, but ultimately trust. You're entrusting your kids with the school, and if you feel so preoccupied that you would want cameras, I just think that is, it's such a red flag. You should actually follow your instinct and your intuition and probably opt out of that school altogether. Okay, Yuri Bezmenov. That's, of course, a pseudonym. And I think if this is the same Yuri Bezmenov, he runs a Substack and operates pseudonymously. He's asking, why has Texas fallen to DEI? And what is really happening with Ken Paxton? Would his removal change things? So I guess we'll answer these in reverse order. I don't know what's happening with Ken Paxton more than anyone else. I trust that whoever Governor Abbott appoints to replace him on a temporary basis will be still doing some of the great work that needs to be done in Texas. But the more interesting, the deeper question is about DEI. So why has Texas fallen to DEI? So I did a series of stories about DEI programs in Texas and looking at Texas's public universities. Texas A&M, University of Houston, University of Texas Austin, and they were essentially indistinguishable from any of the other public or private universities anywhere. They had these huge DEI offices that effectively serve as offices for left-wing political activism. They're even training, students how to think in activist terms. And in a certain sense, people are surprised. Well, how is this at Texas A&M, which is supposed to be a more conservative university? Agricultural and mechanics, right? In a heart of Texas. How has even Texas A&M fallen to DEI? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. The answer is that the political culture of the state doesn't really matter for these questions. Yeah, Texas is a conservative state, and has conservative-ish legislators, right? You have Republican majorities in the legislature, you have a Republican governor, you have a largely Republican voter base. So you have a conservative state. But you have to ask, well, what is the culture on the university campuses? And it's very different than the culture of the state. It's very left-wing at Texas A&M within the administration. I even found some documents at Texas A&M where they were saying One of the big problems that we have at Texas A&M for recruiting great faculty and administrators and students is that we're essentially saddlebagged with a reputation as being in a conservative state and having a conservative culture. So they literally said, this reputation of being a conservative state hinders us from making the university even more left-wing, uniformly left-wing. But look, the university campus in Texas is the same as the university campus in, let's say, a blue state like New York or California or Oregon. With, of course, superficial differences, and I'm sure some differences, of course, not identical. But the University of Texas is more similar to the University of Washington than Texas in general is to Washington in general. And so if you want to make an apples-to-apples comparison, you have to compare the institutional politics rather than the state politics. This is a problem, though, right? Why is this a problem? This is a problem, I think, first and foremost, because the public in Texas, the voters, pay for the Texas State University system. And so what you have is a mismatch that develops. You have a conservative state, you have conservative legislators who are funding left-wing institutions. And so that's why the legislation model legislation that I published, and then was really adapted into legislation in Texas, and then adopted and voted for and passed by the legislature, will be signed shortly by Governor Abbott in the governor's mansion, says, you know what, we're eliminating all the DEI bureaucracy in all of our universities, because legislators realized that they had to actually externally force these public universities in their state to match the values and therefore restrain their operations in a way that brought them back closer to the spirit of the legislation, the spirit of the taxpayers, the spirit of the mission of the universities in their state. And so the idea is to say, you know what, we want Texas A&M to look more to reflect the values that are closer to the voters of Texas than any of the other peer institutions around the country. And so this is a political question and a political problem, really, for conservatives, is how do you make sure that public institutions in a conservative state are reflective of conservative legislative and conservative voting priorities? And how do you restrain them when, for example, all of the conservative waitresses and Uber drivers and electricians in Texas find themselves in the position where they were funding, for example, white privilege seminars. They even had a sex toy giveaway. I think that was at one of the Texas universities that I found, for their queer sex night or whatever. How do you rectify it? How do you solve that? How do you have it so that your working class, kind of red conservative Texas voters are not subsidizing, legions of left-wing bureaucrats drawing $100,000, $200,000 public taxpayer-funded salaries to promote gender theory to the kids, the 18 to 25-year-old kids of these, blue-collar conservative Texans. That's the problem that we're trying to solve. And then we'll take one more question from Substack before we shift over to some of the chat from YouTube. Patricia says, how do openly conservative activists like you survive socially in your neighborhoods, churches, etc.? How do you avoid local cancel culture? This is actually a fun question and a good question. It matters a lot where you live, first and foremost. So I think that is the number one thing. It really does matter where you live. And if you're going to be, and I think people are really adapting to this. Look, Tucker Carlson was famously kind of harassed in a restaurant in D.C. I think they protested outside of his house. He hit the eject button and said, enough of this. He had his, studio in Maine, a studio in Florida, and has really opted out. I had a chance to go visit him at his studio in Maine to do the daytime show, and it's in the middle of nowhere. You fly into Boston, you drive 2 hours, to Portland, Maine, stay overnight, and then in the morning they pick you up and they drive 2 more hours out in the middle of nowhere And talking to people there, he's kind of a little. Tucker's obviously the best known person in this little town, but people are generally very conservative, very friendly, very excited. Tucker has a great time up there. Daily Wire, was based in LA, and they eventually said enough is enough. They moved their operation to Nashville and some other places. I think largely for the same reason, to say, you know what, enough of this. We want to have a friendlier political environment where we live, where we work, where we pay taxes, where we raise our kids. And so that's the same story. And even for me, I moved to a small town, I think about 3 years ago now, just over 3 years ago. And for me, I avoid local cancel culture because it doesn't exist. And in fact, my town is very very friendly to what I'm doing, very supportive. People stop me in the streets and say, "Thank you so much. You're doing great work." As we're building the studio in the last month or so, we have a beautiful office space now. We keep it very low key. We keep it a little bit vague what we do. But one of our neighbors came by to introduce himself and said, "Oh yeah, what do you do?" I said, "Oh yeah, I do research. Our team we work on research." And he was kind of like financial advisor type, looking like Glenn Youngkin with the vest, very very professional. And then the next day he comes back and he says, "Hey, I figured out who you are. Just want to say I love it. Keep it up." And so that's great. I think that actually really matters. And I think for people who are in this space, in the conservative media world, activism world, I know I've found it tremendously valuable to have community support and really broad-based community support. And even I think I've said this before, but even my neighbors, very supportive, and especially during the season of George Floyd, when things were getting tense, things were getting hot. I was in the news fighting critical race theory. A number of the men in my neighborhood set up a little group, and they said, "Hey, if things get out of hand, if the people come to pay you a house visit, if protesters come, just call us and we'll mobilize a dozen heavily armed people in 5 or 6 minutes." And so this is obviously always a very good thing, very comforting for a number of different reasons. But look, I think that it is really important to feel comfortable and confident in what you do, where you live, and certainly the feeling that I had, many other people in this world have had. In some of those more left-wing environments, at a certain point you just have to say, enough is enough. I'm not going to do it anymore. I want to raise my kids in a place where they can still have a childhood and they don't have to be really force-fed and constantly protected from some of the trash that's out there, unfortunately. So let's take some of the YouTube questions. We got Armin moderating. What's up? Yeah, one at a time, yeah. All right. So Armin's going to be feeding them to me, pulling them, censoring the nasty comments. None so far. All right, good work, team. There have been no need for moderation in the YouTube comments so far.
All right, here's the first one.
All right, Armin's sending the first one from Ian. Hello, Chris. What is your view on Peter Thiel's idea that many of the principles of a republic we believe in cannot be implemented democratically, but instead through institutional power? I'm not familiar with the kind of specific argument that Peter Thiel has made here, but if I understand the question correctly, this is a key problem. This is probably the problem that I think about more than anything lately. What happens, much in the way that I was describing in Texas regarding universities, what happens when the republic, the democratic functions of the republic, the legislature, have relatively little power in comparison to the permanent bureaucracy, the permanent administration, activists within the apparatus? And we see this even from Richard Nixon's time onward. Dating further than back, Woodrow Wilson and onward, but really in a mature way from Richard Nixon onward. Nixon understood this. Nixon understood, especially in his second term, that he was not only fighting his political opposition, the Democrats, but even more importantly, he was fighting the permanent bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., including the national security state, the intelligence gathering apparatus that was out to destroy him and successfully ended up destroying him. This is where I feel that some of the post-liberal critics have their feeling on something very real and very frightening. What is the extent to this undemocratic usurpation of our constitutional principles? Can it be beaten back, or is it too late? And I was reading Nixon's diaries recently. And he said in 72, he said, look, this is the last opportunity to restrain the bureaucracy before it strangles American individualism and really strangles our republic. Was he being dramatic in the same way that people say this is the most important election of all time? Yeah, maybe. But it's quite a scary question. It's quite a scary question. Good question, Ian. All right, let's hit me with another one.
All right, here we go.
All right. Robert Sparkman. Could you please describe what each of the words behind DEI are and how they relate to the general principles of wokeness? Thanks. Okay, Robert. Sure. They're all euphemisms, right? That's the first thing to understand right away. None of the words mean what they say at face value. So diversity, the kind of euphemistic meaning, the surface level meaning is people that come from all different backgrounds. But what it really means is people who are avatars of discrete identity blocks that subscribe to a unitary political ideology. So actually, it's really, diversity means, anti-diversity in a sense. It means people who represent demographic blocks but speak the same language, have the same principles and priorities. And so, kind of most famously, someone like Clarence Thomas, the black Supreme Court justice, does not represent diversity because he's conservative. There you go. So E, equity. It's very sneaky how they do it. It's like the word equality, which in the American context means the protection of individual rights regardless of immutable characteristics, race, ethnicity, national origin. It's not really an immutable characteristic, but you're born somewhere, so you can't control it. And equity is something quite different. It actually means not viewing people as an individual, but viewing people as identity-based groups, and then equalizing outcomes according to group identities. So not saying, hey, we're going to protect your rights as an individual, but saying we're going to put you into a group category, and then we're going to redistribute wealth, income, power, prestige, emotions, good feelings, self-esteem, until all groups are equal on a mathematical basis in the aggregate. And inclusion is really the worst one. Inclusion is really the most Orwellian one. It means, in theory, including many different points of view, experiences, many different voices. But in practice actually means including only the approved voices. And so under the guise of inclusion, hate speech, microaggressions, what they call pseudoscience, like men are men, should not be included. Under inclusivity, those should actually be excluded. And so this is a kind of summary of what Robert here is calling wokeness. Using identity blocks to push political orthodoxy, treating people in group aggregate basis and equalizing outcomes, and then rigorously punishing and excluding anything that dissents from the orthodoxy that can be categorized as hate speech or other determinations. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much what they believe. Another person, apparently a Ninja Turtles fan, named Cowabunga Dude. And by the way, Ninja Turtles, I've been watching the new Ninja Turtles movies from the last 10 years or so. And then we watched the old Ninja Turtles movies with my kids, my oldest kids who are 5 and 12. The movies are awesome, so I fully endorse the spirit of Cowabunga Dude. It's great. And it's like there's an Italian angle, they're all named after Renaissance painters. They love pizza. They're like surfer Italian turtles with a Japanese sense. You have to really think, like, what kind of acid-soaked brain, what kind of like LSD trip brain was dreaming up the original Ninja Turtles, and can we please hang out? That would be a lot of fun. Armin, look it up. We got a producer on set. Armin here is helping. I think he's at Not to Louie now on Twitter. Is that right? Yeah. He's respawned after getting banned even under Elon Musk, unfortunately. But he's going to find out who actually invented Ninja Turtles, and were they a kind of LSD oriented? Anyways, Cowabunga Dude asks, what does Chris think about Konstantin Kisin versus Matt Walsh? Disagreement over the efficacy and necessity of softer versus stronger methods. Okay, I like Konstantin and I like Matt both, but look, I'm with Matt on this one, and I think that look at it from a pragmatic basis. Whose approach has driven more results personally, for example? Konstantin's approach or Matt's approach? I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming. Matt, who has a very abrasive style, which sometimes, of course, can verge on maybe too abrasive. I think he would even admit so himself. Look, it gets results. I mean, the movie that he made, really changed the debate fundamentally on radical gender theory, transgender ideology, and he's also successfully mobilized people. He had a great rally in Tennessee. He's helped legislation get kind of steam behind legislation, and then he drives attention. And while I think I don't communicate in the same way, I know Constantine doesn't communicate in the same way because we all have different personal styles. There is no denying that Matt has been extremely effective at busting the narrative of radical gender theory and pushing the issue in a very effective way. And so I just look, politics is often a game of brute ideological force. And so you think that you can be cute about it. You think that you can just get there through mockery or comedy. At the end of the day, you have to do something. You have to set a clear goal. You have to defeat your enemy's ideas, and then you have to engage in the political process and get results. And so I think, what I often say is, look, politics will not be won via podcast. In part, yeah, maybe, fine. But at the end of the day, we have to engage in real politics. And it's not always pretty. Some of the most devastatingly effective political ads in history. And this is something I love. I love political ads. I love looking at the old ones. They would accuse each other of, you're gonna set off nuclear Armageddon, or you'd have the Willie Horton ad, the famous Willie Horton ad. It's supposed to be like this horrible thing, totally beyond the pale. I don't think so. I don't think so at all. And in fact, those are very effective ads. And even the ads against Trump that I thought were wrong, that I thought were unfair, that I thought were hyperbolic, that the Biden campaign was putting on. Look, it's a political campaign. This is a fight. That stuff works. That's always how it is. I recently read a letter from Cicero's brother in Roman times, as Cicero was trying to become consul, as he was trying to become the man in power in Rome. And his brother gave him political advice. And some of the stuff you read, and it's like, my eyes are popping out of my head. It's so amazing. It's so cool. He's like, you have to lie about your enemies. You have to be fake with people to cultivate their friendships and then use their power against them. You have to spread sexual scandal and gossip about your opponent. All of the dirty tricks that you find in politics today that are supposedly modern innovations and terrible and awful, you should never do it. Politicians have been doing them for the entire history of Republican government, for 2,000 years, 2,000 plus years. And I'm sure the Greeks did it, 500 years before that. And so, look, if you think that, Dave Chappelle and Joe Rogan, through their humor and, 3-hour, podcasts and, kind of chain smoking and whiskey drinking are gonna win the day and gonna win politics, you've got another thing coming, because that's just not realistic at all. You have to play politics, and for better or for worse, I personally think it's great and I love it. You're gonna have to get dirty. You're gonna actually have to fight, and someone like Matt Walsh is a fighter, and I personally really appreciate what he does on that basis, and
we have a
God bless him.
Cowabunga.
Cowabunga, dude. Okay,
Says,
follow up.
Matt's film was more consistent with Constantine's approach, isn't it?
Matt's film was more consistent with Constantine's approach, says Cowabunga in a follow-up. Yes, I think that's true, and so, but maybe that shows that Matt has a wider range, but then again, maybe that's not true, because even Elon Musk's Twitter today, or yesterday or whatever, had suggested that Matt's film was hate speech, So I think that the film is good satire, it's good comedy. That's a tool, right? These are all tools that we use. I think I try to use it to a certain extent. But I think where Matt is consistently very effective in his political communication is when he's just swinging and fighting and being outrageous. And look, is there a kind of downside to that? Could you turn some people off? Yeah, probably. But I think that it's more than justified, though, and more than worthwhile, because ultimately, I think politics is, you're never going to win the politics by appealing just to the center. You have to motivate your people first and foremost. You have to make clear distinctions. Cowabunga. Waves up, surfs up, I don't know what they say.
So I have an answer on the Ninja Turtles.
All right, here's the answer on Ninja Turtles. What's the answer?
So it was created by two guys, Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, who were comic book artists who wrote it as a parody of over-the-top 80s comics.
Okay, so we're hearing that the Ninja Turtles was two white dudes in America, that were doing it as a spoof of
the over-the-top 80s.
Of over-the-top 80 comic books. So it was actually, this is blowing my mind, live. It's actually satire. Is that what you're telling me?
Yes.
God bless you, Peter Laird and Kevin Eastman. Wherever we should get them on a stream and interview these guys if they're still alive. That's for another day. Okay, let's get the next one.
All right. So this is the next one. I can't pronounce the name.
Greetings from Latvia. All right. Wonder what time it is in Latvia. Which are the routes that you see that could eventually bridge the chasm between the right and left and give opportunity for a broader coalition against the fringe? I think this kind of falls in nicely with the previous question. It's how do you tailor political communications? Do you tailor it to your side? Do you tailor it to the center? And I just think that given the structural dynamics in American politics right now, but even as a general rule, I just think that it's political death, and political political kind of a self-defeating strategy to try to appeal to the center, to appeal beyond left and right. You have to pick a side. If you want to be effective, you have to pick a side. Apologies to libertarians, apologies to centrists, apologies to Andrew Yang, apologies to the people who are trying to start a third party, labels. That's not how politics works. You have to have a political base first. And then you go and you try to capture as far to the center or as far to the other side as possible. But anyone who appeals first to the center, it's a good media strategy, to be honest. If you're the kind of Bulwark or Dispatch or going the other way, the kind of dissident left, the dissident right, the crossover, the people who dance on the center line, and the kind of defectors. They do very well on the Substack and the podcast circuit, but they're not affected politically. They're actually marginalized politically. And so that's what I've learned. And I used to believe in the whole appeal to the center, don't preach to the choir. And an experience taught me very quickly that's the way to maybe feel good about yourself, not have to get your hands dirty, but ultimately not to be able to do much at all. All right, and before I go into a coughing fit here as I recover from this cold, we'll take one last question from John Weingarten. Chris, love what you do. What advice would you give to a recent college grad who wants to follow a similar path that you've taken? Are you hiring? Made a few popular vids on homelessness. Oh wow, I John Weingarten, I appreciate the initiative. Sure, send in a resume. That's fine. We are hiring sometime. Although we have Joe who's behind the video here. He's doing a great job. You're never going to displace Joe. And Armin's got all the facts on the Ninja Turtles. So we're in really good hands right now. But we may be expanding a little bit. So please send it in. But a recent college grad who wants to follow a path that I've taken, don't recommend it, to be honest. I spent 10 years making documentaries. Then I got into politics kind of in a backwards way. I tried running for local office with having no idea what I was getting into. That was a kind of debacle. And then I ended up, writing and doing political journalism and then became an accidental activist. There's no real method beyond experimentation to what I've done. I don't think that it's necessarily a good model for anyone else. But what I would say, and maybe if I do have some lessons to impart to a recent college grad, is, use those first years after college to take a risk, to try something, to start a business, to travel around the world, to make a film, to get involved in something that is high risk, high reward, because, you might fail, but what I found, and really through making mistakes actually, is that failing quickly at that young age is relatively low cost ultimately to your life. You might get embarrassed. I know that even after I graduated, I was making films, and when I was making my first documentary, I was broke. I was making my first documentary. I didn't have any money. And so I was working night job as a security guard, which was actually a great job. I met incredible people. But socially, it's like, what the hell is Chris doing? Some of my friends at the time and associates at the time were like, wait a minute, dude, you went to Georgetown and now you're working as a security guard. This seems like a bad plan. And in a way, it's like, yeah, it probably was a bad plan. It all worked out in the end. And actually, I look back at the security guard job as like one of my favorite jobs of all time. And it allowed me then to save money, to make a film. And once the film got picked up, then I was able to transition into full-time film work. But if you're not willing to take a chance, if you're not willing to kind of embarrass yourself, if you're not willing to forego immediate status, like I got an internship, at whatever, I think you could have an interesting career and maybe doing something kind of unique. And for me, that's always good. For me, that's a kind of a meaningful path to do something different.
Let's take one more. We got a super chat.
Oh, one more. We got a super chat. Yep. This is the first time. I'm not even really sure what a super chat is, but it sounds important.
Donation.
It's a donation. All right, great. Thank you. All right, from Mark Baumer. What can conservatives learn from prohibition and swinging the pendulum too far? That's a good question. I don't know. I'm not a historian of the prohibition era. But look, I don't think that we're in risk of swinging the pendulum too far at all. Here's the difference. The prohibition era, like many other cycles in American history, was a religious great awakening. The abolition of slavery was in large part driven by a religious great awakening, a Christian great awakening to the moral evil of slavery. Then you have the Prohibition era, the same thing. It was the temperance movement. Thank you so much. It was a lot of people that had a religious conviction. They saw the kind of devastations of alcoholism, what it did to families and communities, and they were inspired to take action during Prohibition. And we can debate Prohibition, good or bad. I don't think it was all bad, to be honest. I think there were, some good things about Prohibition, frankly. If you look at even the social science data subsequent to Prohibition. But we're like so far away from having a widespread, powerful, religious great awakening in our society. We're struggling right now to ban graphic pornography in kindergarten classrooms. We're like barely able to restrict books that teach young children how to use gay sex apps and engage in BDSM and kink and sex toy acts in like elementary school. And so for many people in our society, that is going too far. Hands off the porn in schools. That is like a right-wing violation. That's like worse than Prohibition. So I think we're so far away from swinging the pendulum too far. I don't even actually think any conservatives are even proposing ideas, honestly, even kind of long-term ideas that would swing the pendulum too far in the mainstream, right? So mainstream conservatives are taking a very moderate view, and the cultural conditions right now in the United States would not permit something as kind of radical and, let's say, conservative as a prohibition. I'm not even really sure what the equivalent would be. I guess before we leave, it's been an hour. Thanks for putting up with me. This has actually been a lot of fun chatting with you. I want to give a shout out to D. Martin and Facts Rule for super chats, which I'm just learning about now. Facts Rule, God bless you, man. Keep them up with the facts. The facts are part of it, although not all of it. I would say emotions rule and facts drool. But I appreciate the participation. And so I'm hoping to feel better over the weekend. I'm going to take a little sail this weekend with my kids. Hopefully some sun will be helpful. I know that I'm going to have a good Friday. Regardless, I hope that you have a good Friday. And if this is something that you like, subscribe to the Substack, rufo.substack.com. Drop me a line in the open Q&A, which is my most recent post, and just say, hey, I like this. I want you to do more of this. I'm certainly considering doing this like once a month, maybe even for paid subscribers. But if you like this format, if you like the live stream, if you like the more casual conversational element, if you like Armin giving us the facts on Ninja Turtles, and you would like to get him a microphone so that we can actually hear him in the background, I think that would be awesome. We're going to make this like a little bit of a cool interactive chat. I had a lot of fun. So thanks, Joe. Thanks, Armin. Thanks to everyone who participated. Thanks to the Substack subscribers. Thanks to the super chatters. And thank you first and last, although last and foremost, to all of the Ninja Turtle fans out there. We're signing off.